Presidents are often regarded as great men, but what does great even mean? Does that speak to their moral virtue, their ability to lead the nation, their historical significance? For Lyndon Johnson, greatness meant power. More specifically, power over your fellow man. The kind of unique, all-encompassing power that few human beings could handle. Not only could Johnson handle this power, he chased it, he worked for it, he needed it. Presidents are ambitious by nature. My sister just gave me this wonderful Swiss lemonade. Presidents are ambitious by nature, but Lyndon Johnson might be the most ambitious of all of them. Johnson's ambition would, of course, succeed in bringing him that immense power that he so desperately craved. Power that Johnson used to pass civil rights legislation and his Great Society programs. The same power that Johnson would use to send 500,000 American soldiers to Vietnam.
There's no question in my mind that in this century, the three greatest politicians, active politicians, were Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. Nobody else of the presidents was in their league as political operators.
LBJ is a deeply flawed liar, cheater, abuser, and election stealer. Yet he is still enormously complex and infinitely interesting. Greater minds than my own have tackled Johnson and created some amazing work. Robert Caro has an incredible series of books whose detailed portrait of the 36th president is longer than the Christian Bible without even being completed yet. Without Caro's work, this video wouldn't be possible, and I recommend that anyone who is interested in this subject check them out because they really are fantastic.
And as Robert Caro so poetically pointed out in his book, he knew what the presidency was for.
This is the only one that I own a physical copy of, but it's not the one we're going to be discussing in this particular video.
Maybe we can get through LBJ in that period.
Oh yes, I can do that.
Okay.
You know, there's this terrible book out on him, this Caro book.
Oh, I know it by George
I read
Reedy. Did you read, is it Reedy's book?
No,
this new
the
Caro book. Yeah.
It gets a rave review from Clifton Fadiman in Book of the Month. Unbelievable.
Stand by.
Shit, it makes him feel like a goddamn animal.
Quiet.
Of course he was.
The events described in this video are only a small part of the series' first book, Path to Power. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the video, it really does help out. Also, let me know in the comments below what other president would you like to see explored in this fashion. I've been making my way through the behemoth that is the Caro series, but I would love to learn about other presidents when I'm done. Some would say that power corrupts, but Robert Caro argues that power reveals. Few men understood power like Lyndon Johnson. As president, LBJ was able to pass through civil rights and healthcare legislation that would have been impossible before he took office. What was it about Johnson that allowed him to pass such difficult legislation?
He wanted to call on senators and representatives to pass a civil rights bill, the most sweeping since Reconstruction. Most of his staff counseled him against it. And one particularly bold aide said, he did not believe a president should spend his time and power on lost causes, however worthy they might be. To which it is said, President Johnson replied, well, what the hell's the presidency for?
Many would cite his experience as majority leader of the United States Senate prior to his presidency. In the seniority-dominated Senate, Johnson managed to not only be the youngest majority leader in American history, but also the most powerful one up to that point.
Your technique of leadership is considerably different. If I may, I'd like to quote from a chap here who one observer's quoted in one of your biographies. Being won over by Johnson is a rather overwhelming experience. The full treatment is an incredibly potent mixture of persuasion, badgering, flattery, threats, reminders of past favors and future advantages. Well, that's a technique for leadership, obviously.
Throughout his entire life, Johnson had favored whatever position was more beneficial to him in that moment, both in politics and in personal matters. People who knew Johnson would say Lyndon goes where the wind blows. In his 1937 congressional campaign, Johnson rode the coattails of FDR's popularity as a true liberal and a New Dealer. This led to many meetings between these two masters of politics at the White House during Johnson's early political career. Johnson maintained this liberal appearance until FDR's death and the rise of New Deal skepticism, where he started to posture as a more conservative figure instead. Johnson's father told him as a young boy that you can't be in politics unless you can walk in a room and know in a minute who's for you and who's against you. LBJ took these words to heart as he would become an exceptional reader of men.
He understood the way the Senate worked. He understood what senators needed and what they wanted. He had biographies on each of them so that he knew what their tastes and intentions and aims and desires and wishes and hopes were.
Johnson had the ability to talk to you and figure out what you were saying before you even finished saying it. If he was trying to flatter someone, he would agree with their opinion and reach the conclusion they were working towards before they had in order to appear more in agreement with them. Lyndon Johnson could pinpoint a person's biggest insecurity as easily as if it were simply written on their expression. If he knew that someone struggled with speaking, he would get in their good graces by saying something like, "Great speech, John," which would hit close to home for the other party. If Johnson sought to hurt you, however, he could use your biggest insecurity against you like a weapon.
LBJ taught 5th, 6th, and 7th graders in Cotulla, Texas. Can you imagine the experience of being an 11-year-old who forgot your homework and tried to explain it to Lyndon Johnson?
Once, Johnson was so dissatisfied with a cup of coffee from a recently divorced secretary that he screamed at her that her inability to make a coffee was why she couldn't keep a husband. But how did Johnson develop these qualities? The hunger and drive that would propel him from humble beginnings to the highest seats of power. His unique ambition and the cruelty that came in service of it. What environment shaped this master of politics? How did young Lyndon Johnson become the LBJ we know today? Lyndon Johnson was born to idealistic parents in the hill country of Texas, a place where idealism goes to die. After traversing what seemed like never-ending flatland, many settlers fell for the trap that was the beautiful Texas hill country. A mirage of prosperity whose beauty was quite literally only skin deep. The plentiful grass laid on top of shallow soil whose nutrients were not easily replaced. Even that beautiful green grass had been growing for several years, uninterrupted by human settlement. The farmers who settled the hill country were encouraged by their early successes, only to see diminishing returns every following year as they depleted the area's natural resources. Despite being part of the United States in the 20th century, the life of someone in the hill country of Texas looked more like that of a medieval peasant. With no running water, electricity, or plumbing, these people led very difficult lives. The people of the hill country weren't just poor, they were poor in one of the worst areas to live in the entire country. A place where everyone had to work themselves to death just to get by. A place where people worked so hard that they would die fast and age even faster.
There's no other place, no Virgin Islands, no Miami coastlines, no boat trips across the Atlantic that can do for me what this soil and what this land and what this water and what this people and what these hills and these surroundings can do. They represent the memories of half a century. And they provide the stimulation and the inspiration that nothing else or no one else can provide.
The Johnson family had been fighting the natural decline of the hill country's prosperity for generations. Triumph followed by tragedy, time and time again, a family cursed by a vicious cycle. LBJ's father, Sam Ely Johnson, was a politician who prided himself as an honest figure, someone who stayed away from the corruption and bribery that was all too common in his time. The elder Johnson worked hard to cultivate his image as a good, honest man, someone who you could trust and depend on. Mr. Sam, as he was known in Johnson City, wanted to be respected, and he did so by keeping up his appearance. He invested in expensive suits and a nice car, things that someone of his status should definitely be able to afford. The problem was that he couldn't. As previously stated, the elder Johnson was an honest politician, but honesty doesn't pay, especially in those days. Sam Johnson could barely even afford to stay in Austin during the legislative sessions. This and other financial troubles would eventually lead to him giving up his seat in the Texas House of Representatives in 1923. Most politicians could find a good job in the private sector based off of the relationships they had cultivated with lobbyists. But Johnson hadn't cultivated any relationships with lobbyists. In fact, he explicitly avoided them. Left without the type of position that would usually be given to a former statesman, Mr. Sam would then fall into a series of bad business decisions that would lead him into massive debt, unable to provide for his family. The once respected Sam Johnson was now the laughingstock of their small town. He owed so much money to banks and stores in town that he would actually have to visit other towns in order to find someone who was willing to lend it to him. After a while, even this stopped working because even the other towns started to catch on. In a twist of irony, Mr. Sam would end up working as a day laborer on a road that he himself had authorized the building of as a state representative. But let's rewind. Before he ran out of money, before he lost his social standing, before he failed, let's go back to the happiest day of Sam Ely Johnson's life. August 27th, 1908, Lyndon Johnson was born. During Johnson's boyhood, he would develop some peculiar tendencies that would go on to define the rest of his life. If the young Johnson couldn't lead whatever group he was playing with, he didn't want to play at all. Lyndon was bossy, but he was also a crybaby who would whine if he didn't get what he wanted. Young LBJ possessed something that almost no one in his entire town had: a ball. And ever the cunning young man, Johnson made sure to use this to his advantage. LBJ was a terrible pitcher, but if the other boys didn't let him pitch, he would just take his ball and go home. Lyndon Johnson had to stand out. He could not bear to be one in a crowd. Not in Congress, not in college, not in a group of young boys. The life of Lyndon Johnson is like something out of a Shakespeare play. His dramatic rise and fall is one of the most interesting in American history. If you're enjoying this video, you're probably into epic stories like LBJ's. If that's the case, you might enjoy this video's sponsor, Bobbletopia. They have a lot of awesome bobbleheads like one of LBJ himself and an array of other historical figures and fictional characters. Use code André Dutra for 10% off your bobblehead of choice, and make sure to let me know which one you get in the comment section down below. Any purchase you make directly helps out the channel, and it's a great way to support me if you enjoy the content. The son of an honest and idealistic politician fallen from grace, what lessons would Sam Johnson pass on to his son? Honestly, not many. LBJ saw what honesty and goodwill did to his parents. With no money and even less goodwill, the talkative Johnson would become quiet and depressed whenever he was reminded of his status. Even as a teenager, LBJ wanted to be popular. He wanted to be a leader among men, but honestly, he just wasn't. He was tall and skinny and awkward. In the Caro book, there's plenty of descriptions of Johnson walking around everywhere, just kind of throwing his really, really long arms around, and people would just take notice of that. And it's honestly just funny to think about this future president just kind of striding down with his skinny long arms looking all goofy. Before he left politics, Sam Johnson would take his oldest son Lyndon to the state legislature with him, and Lyndon was enthralled by the experience. As a child, LBJ got his first look at real power, and for the rest of his life, he never wanted anything else so badly.
All of my life, I have wanted to be a public servant. My father ahead of me was, and I grew up wanting to help people with their problems. And I get a satisfaction and a sense of achievement from constructive efforts on behalf of human beings that you can't get in almost any other profession.
From a very young age, little Lyndon was already telling people he was going to be the president of the United States one day, and every decision that he made in his life going forward was in service of that goal. Johnson wanted to escape the poverty and humiliation that defined his early life, and attaining power was the way he was going to do it. An important talent that the young Johnson developed during this time was his ability to make older people like him. While all the other kids played, Johnson would spend hours upon hours talking to their parents. In these moments, the loud, brash Johnson became kind and polite, listening closely to what they said and agreeing with every word. LBJ was as pleasant with parents as he was terrible with his fellow children. He might have been bossy and mean with his peers, but with any adult, he was the perfect son. This talent, of course, wasn't just limited to his hometown. While he was in college, LBJ would sit on the floor, put his hands on his face, and listen to his professors talk, listening very closely and agreeing with every word that they said. As long as you were in a position to help Lyndon Johnson, he would kiss up to you better than anybody else. He might agree with one professor on something, then 10 minutes later agree with a different professor who was saying the opposite. This would lead to the other students on campus referring to him as Bullshit Johnson. In Congress, liberals thought he was liberal and conservatives thought that he was a conservative. The professional son thing? He would go on to do that with legendary masters of politics like FDR and Sam Rayburn, and this talent was part of what brought him closer to the power that he sought so desperately. His childhood poverty filled Lyndon with an insatiable need for wealth. Psychologically, he needed money and needed it badly. Johnson's congressional campaigns were aided by construction company Brown and Root and the oil men behind it, in exchange for Johnson representing their interests on Capitol Hill. While Johnson was still a member of the House of Representatives, he was offered a golden ticket by his corporate backers, a lucrative oil investment worth nearly $1 million at the time that was basically gifted to LBJ with no strings attached. Johnson, however, turned down the deal, saying that, quote, having oil money would kill me politically. This caused confusion as Johnson represented the state of Texas, where oil money didn't exactly hurt a politician. Any hopes of becoming governor or senator in the future would not be affected. It was at this point they realized there was only one office where having oil would hurt LBJ, and that was the presidency. Johnson would eventually own a radio and TV empire, which made him a millionaire. The Johnson media business was supposedly ran solely by his wife without his input whatsoever, even though that is easily disproven. The only thing that LBJ wanted more than money was power. As long as Johnson's path to power was open, nothing, not even $1 million, could get in the way of it. His entire life, he needed power. He needed to be the one in control. This man that became one of the great politicians of the 21st century was so motivated by his ambition that no matter how far back you look, you can see him acting in service of it at every single step. Every cruel and savage action made solely in service of his ambition and quest for power. One story that stuck out to me was that Sam Johnson was going to take his teenage son Lyndon to Austin one day in order to buy Lyndon a suit. Of course, the family had already fallen on hard times, so Sam was likely going to get Lyndon the cheapest suit that he possibly could. Lyndon, however, did not want a cheap suit, and he decided that he was going to drive to Austin the day before with one of his friends and meet up with the tailor he was supposed to visit with his dad. When he arrived at the tailor, Johnson got fitted for one of the more expensive suits that were available in the shop. He then told the tailor that he was going to come back the next day with his dad, but told the tailor to pretend like he had never seen him before. LBJ then told the tailor to recommend the expensive suit to his father right off the bat when they get there, his father not knowing that LBJ had already been fitted for it. His father wanted to keep up appearances, and because of this, he ended up just buying the extremely expensive suit. This is just one example of the extreme manipulation that LBJ was capable of from a very young age. In many ways, LBJ sought to emulate his father, but in many others, he sought to surpass him. The two men even bore a significant physical resemblance to each other, as they had large noses and large ears that were very distinguishing features. There was one similarity between the two Johnson men that Lyndon would be tortured by for his entire life. Throughout Johnson's childhood, he heard his family discussing how Johnson men had weak hearts. This was such a prevalent topic of conversation that people began to say Johnson men don't live past 60. This proved to be hauntingly true when Sam Johnson, after suffering multiple heart attacks throughout his life, was finally killed by one in 1937 at just 60 years old. LBJ's awareness of his limited time on Earth is one of the most important facts in understanding his insatiable drive. The reason he worked unimaginably hard and abused others until they did the same. The reason he could never waver on his pursuit of what he so deeply craved. In addition to a genetic predisposition, Johnson was known to work 20-hour days filled with sleep deprivation, unhealthy eating, heavy drinking, and of course, smoking 60 cigarettes a day. Johnson would suffer from his first heart attack at age 47, which he described as the worst heart attack a man could have and still live. He would suffer a second heart attack at 55, a third at 63, a fourth at 64, and a fifth fatal heart attack at age 65.
I'm talking to Tom Johnston, the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson, who has reported that the 36th President of the United States died this afternoon in an ambulance plane on the way to San Antonio, where he was taken after being stricken at his ranch, the LBJ Ranch in Johnson City, Texas.
This video doesn't touch on anywhere near the full extent of LBJ's ambition and the cruelty that he used to service it. There is so much content in the Caro books that frankly I could do an entire series on LBJ LBJ, and that might be the plan depending on how this video goes. The life of Lyndon Johnson is a story of epic proportions, and I can't do it justice with just this one video. It only touches on a small part of the first novel, and I recommend more than anything that you read the series. I'm currently obsessed with it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Also make sure to leave a comment on which other president would you like to see covered in a video of this style. Also make sure to check out the sponsor Bobbletopia, and even leave a donation down below if you're feeling generous. Once again, my name is André Dutra, and thank you for watching.